We'll be starting in about 2 minutes if people can regather. And I put up this particular slide if anybody want to take a shot of it on your phone or see it more closely. And I'll be changing it for the second half in just a moment. Oh, yes, Barbara Ehrenreich, one who wrote Nickel and Dime. Okay, she's very Ehrenreich, Ehrenreich, I think. You get it. Yeah, it will. Okay, good.
That's what I thought. Yep. I'd like to do that. Okay, great. And you want me to say something about this?
Yes,
Okay.
that'd be great.
And let me ask you a question. Can I read these three quotes to introduce the second half? They're in your
Sure.
book.
Yeah.
Because what it says is that this thing about
Oops. Okay, there you go.
is real. So would you mind if I just pull that?
Sure.
Is it okay? So let me do this. I'll do this, and then I'll tell you.
Okay, or you could do that. Read the quotes last.
Read the quotes last. I think that's perfect. Okay. Great.
We have a lot of picture takers of this.
So me just the little restaurant.
Yeah, people are. But you can get started.
Great. I want to get underway for our second part of Diana's talk. And let me do a public service announcement. Diana's book, Grateful, the Transformative Power of Giving Thanks. This book is going to be available to the general public on April 3rd. But thanks to Westar, you can get a copy now. It'll be available in the book area. So special privilege for Westar folks that Diana's book is being made available to you before it's being available to the general public. Okay, so please make note of that. That's my copy.
You can keep that.
I will. To my right, at the end of every table is a sign-up sheet. I am asking this on behalf of Diana. Diana has a newsletter that she puts out online, or it's an email newsletter. Pardon me? Once every 2 weeks. Okay, an email once every 2 weeks. If you are interested in receiving that, there is a sign-up sheet at the end of every one of these long tables. Put your name, email, please be really clear in your printing, and then just pass the sign-up sheet, all the way down. And then at the end of this session, we'll pick them up and Diana will include you on her e-newsletter twice monthly.
Just like in Methodist Church. You know how you sign in one end and pass the book down?
To introduce the second half, I want to read 3 very brief quotes that are in the book, in Diana's book. And one of the things that I love about these 3 quotes is that they point to the reality of gratefulness within us all. Elie Wiesel, when people lack gratitude, something is missing in their humanity. When people lack gratitude, something is missing in their humanity. The positive side of that is that the fullness of humanity includes gratitude. Okay. Jonathan Haidt, reciprocity is a deep instinct. It is the basic currency of social life. Reciprocity is a deep instinct. It is the basic currency of social life. Okay, this is good news. And Stephen Hawking, where there is life, there is hope.
Thank you.
Diana.
Well, thank you so much. During the break, some of the comments and questions that I received were astonishing and very encouraging. So I really appreciate receiving those gifts. One of the things that did come up is two people very just back to back came up to me while I was standing over there right after I'd finished. And one gentleman had his phone on and he showed me a picture of gratitude that had just been sent to him by his daughter. And it's a picture of a young woman who is clearly a millennial age person who is at a campsite and she's standing there like this. And so it was just lovely because that's the kind of picture that I get all the time from my daughter, who is 20. If there is a mountain, she climbs it. She gets to the top of the mountain and the selfie she takes or the picture she has her friend take is always like this, or some sort of posture of awe and beauty and wonder. It's just amazing. So to see that picture of the campsite with the millennial and the posture of gratitude that I had up here on the board was lovely. And then the next person came up and told me that she has always had a difficult time sort of seeing past her own understandings of gratitude, which were naturally inclined towards the idea of giving back to a community. And she's since learned, as she shared with me, a much broader sense of gratitude. But her initial sorts of ways of thinking about gratefulness were because we've been giving gifts, you give back. And she talked about especially how that's can be a strong impulse in local communities, things like charities and small city governments and county groups and park services, people who literally just understand that our lives are surrounded by abundance and that there is a kind of a duty to give back is recognition to that abundance and those gifts. And to have those two comments come up back to back really spoke to something important about the bar graph and then this picture. Because one of the things I run into with great frequency is particularly older adults who have been in churches for so long, or synagogues or other religious organizations and traditions, not really being able to understand how younger adults experience some of the dimensions of spirituality and religious life. And so these two comments back to back just got me to thinking, wouldn't we be so much better off if we could really have an intergenerational sort of conversation about how we understand gratitude, and that young adults could really begin to kind of understand the complex vision of a different moment in American history where we emphasized abundance and giving back and sort of social responsibility to one another. And at the same time, the adults who are formed in that kind of culture could understand that the young woman at the campsite, is a really equally legitimate expression of gratitude, and that these two things work together. The personal and the emotive and the communal and the ethical sit at the same table, as it were. And this wonderful picture here is by Jan Richardson, who is a poet and a liturgist and an artist who does amazing work. I commend her books to you highly. If we all sat at the same table and we could share those stories, it begins to create a sort of a much healthier social dynamic and a much healthier dynamic between generations, which are, believe me, from my experience right now, it almost seems like we're at war with one another generationally. There's so little understanding of what is going on across generational lines. It actually worries me. With that, I just want to comment on those two questions because they were quite beautiful and they were literally right together in this little space in about 5 minutes time. To see the fullness of gratitude in both sets of stories, the one about the daughter and the one about serving a community. So I want to move on and talk about this, the external shape of gratitude. I'm thinking about renaming this slide and talking about the geometry of gratitude. And you'll see why in a second. This is always something fun when there's a new book that comes out, to be able to think about, how do I depict it in these pictures so that it makes sense and communicates visually what I've written and what I'm passionate about. So think of this as the geometry of gratitude, the form that gratitude takes. This guy again, he just will not go away. One of the things that I kind of love about art, and my mom was an artist, my grandfather was an artist. I did not wind up following that path, but I grew up knowing about art, is that pictures, the things we choose to put on paper like this or canvas, they communicate things we believe in, things that we want other people to see. And they do that in this very visual sense that we were talking about, you know, the characteristics of God, as it were, on the surface level. But all good pictures have something else, and that is they have geometric form. And that geometric form is very intentional, put in the paintings by artists to communicate sort of subliminal and deeper ideas that aren't necessarily immediately apprehended, but that they move you in some direction. And so part of this picture in its geometric form is a triangle. Now, if we were in theology class, the next discussion would probably be about the Trinity, which is probably something that is intended by this artist and wants to communicate it. But there's something else going on here too. And it is more apropos to the field I was trained in, and that is church history. This is a painting from 1515. And one of the things that is true about 1515 is that European society, I don't know what that is, Dom. If that's my heart, that's a problem. Yeah, let's see if that works a little better. Is that better? No, it's not better. He said not to put it too high. How about there? Too high? Oh gosh, okay, I'm getting conflicting stuff. Okay, does that work? Okay. Technology. So anyway, part of what is at play here is this idea of the triangle. And in 1515, that's the way society was shaped. And the way church was shaped is the social structures of medieval Europe were pyramid structures. And I don't have to belabor that point here. The great chain of being, the structure of feudalism, the structure of the medieval Catholic Church. And so in a very real sense, this painting of God in a structure like this is communicating the Trinity. And it's also creating a divinization of the social structures of medieval Europe. Okay, we've got a real issue going on. Yeah, I don't think it's me. I can stand in one place and do this. Maybe. Oh, I think. Movement. At least a little bit. Okay, so it's a divinization of the social structures of medieval Europe. And if we think about Western history, it has often been in the form of a pyramid. It's not the only social structure that would have been available to our ancestors, but the pyramid emerged as the dominant social structure of Europe. Boy, I've got problems all over the place today. Okay. So here we have where it really started in terms of Western history. Egyptian social structure in the shape of a pyramid with Pharaoh on top, slaves on the bottom, and everybody in between. One of the things I love to talk about with church people is how this pyramid was at play in the Exodus story and stories of the Hebrew scriptures. And I just love the story of the Exodus because the people on the bottom are going to be released from this oppressive social structure. And they go out, into the wilderness. Moses has led them into freedom. And what does God want to do with them? And God has already told Moses before Moses sets these people free what God wants to do. And that is he wants them to settle in this land, and that it's going to be a land of milk and honey where everyone has their own vine and fig tree, and they're going to be farmers. So in other words, in the Hebrew scriptures, God does not send them out of Egypt to go into the Holy Land and build new pyramids, even though the people who had been held in slavery were clearly capable of building pyramids. It's not the society that God dreams of. The society God dreams of is a place where people are connected to the earth, where they're living in community together, where there are judges in the center of community, and there's not a strict kind of hierarchical arrangement. There's very little hierarchy in that early sort of vision of what Israel is going to emerge as. It's more like this. When you go through the Hebrew Bible, of course, that begins to change. And you get to that wonderful passage in Samuel where the Hebrew people finally cry out to God, we want a king. In other words, we want to have a structure like this. We want to be like the Egyptians. We want to be like the Babylonians. We want to build better pyramids than our neighbors. And so God says to them, no, you don't want to do that. And if you do that, what's going to happen is that you're going to have oppression. You're going to have your son sent to war. You're going to have heavy taxes. You're going to have all kinds of terrible things happen to you. And people of Israel say, we don't care. We'll do it better. We promise. Then they do a Mesopotamia. And God says, no, really, you don't want a king. And then finally, they go back and forth like that. And finally, God gives up and says, whatever. And then you have the rest of the prophets and the exile and all that stuff unfold. And what it is really the whole story of Israel trying to deal with this social structure and how this social structure always winds up in a place where Israel is at the bottom. It's not nice. And so then opens the New Testament. And we have Israel at the bottom of another social structure like this, another pyramid. And here Pharaoh is replaced by Caesar. And we have all those layers of social classes. And then we have slaves, freed slaves, and manual laborers all at the bottom. And that's pretty much where Israel resides during the time of Jesus, is in these bottom three sort of oppressive categories. So I look at this and I think to myself, how do these kinds of structures hold together? Because it just doesn't make any sense in some ways that they should become the historically dominant structures, because most people are on the bottom and the fewest people are at the top. And of course, the few people at the top have redirected all of the resources from the bottom up to them. So you have few people and resource heavy up here and lots of people and resource thin down here. It shouldn't work. But yet it does. It works because of big armies, usually. So violence is one of the things that holds these kinds of structures together. But of course, this room does not need to be told. It also holds together because of this. That within the pyramid, they had constructed a mechanism that actually held the whole together. And one of my huge surprises when I was writing this book about gratitude was when I did my sort of etymology search on the word grateful. And immediately you go over to Merriam-Webster, and it says the word grateful comes from the Latin gratia. And I looked at that and I thought, I thought gratia meant gift or favor. Well, of course, gratia means gift or favor, and it also means gratitude. And it was gratia was the currency of this system that was built within the pyramid, where patrons, the people in the upper classes, had people below them as clients, and then clients had to return the gifts that the patrons gave through gratitude. And so gratia is from the patron to the client, and then gratia in the form of gratitude runs from the client back to the patron. And patrons, of course, provide provision, protection, money, and access for these people who are beneath them. And then the clients are required to return loyalty, thanks, and allegiance. And this particular structure, like I said, as you well know, so I'm not really telling you anything you don't know, is what is the sort of the secret sauce of this whole structure. It is what holds it together. And so people are surprised, literally surprised in churches when I tell them, for example, that Caesar's title means Lord and Savior of the universe, and that anything that you have, if you're at the bottom of that pyramid, if you have a single scrap of bread to eat, it is because Caesar, in Caesar's grace, gave that bread to you. All gifts, however meager, however thinly distributed, however hard you worked to make sure that you got in line to get one of those gifts, comes from the hands of Caesar through this patronage system. And then, of course, because Caesar is Lord and Savior of the universe, your job is to say thank you. And wouldn't it be nice if Caesar just took the card? But of course, Caesar doesn't. You have to give back some 90% of everything you make in this hierarchical sort of setup of patronage and clienthood, so that enough money gets back up to Caesar so that Caesar knows that you're really, truly grateful. And if you don't pay up that thank you money, then something bad can happen to you. You could be sent into exile. You could, your son could be made a soldier in the Roman army and sent to serve in the north of Britain, where he's going to get killed with guys who have their faces painted blue coming down from Scotland. Those were my ancestors. You know, your land, whatever you have, could be taken away from you. Your daughter could be married off into another family, all kinds of terrible things. You can be killed for not paying up, for not saying thank you. And so you actually had money payoffs that moved up the system, but then you were required to worship Caesar. So you had to give your heart, not just your cash, to Caesar. And Caesar, out of the money and the heart, expected total and absolute loyalty throughout the entire system. And there were people and systems and structures built in to ensure that. And so that's how these things stayed in place for a long time. Of course, ancient Rome winds up being one of the most effective pyramid systems that humankind ever devised. It lasted a really long time. And all it did for most of its history was get stronger and stronger and stronger, removing the rich further and further and further from the poor. And it, you know, we can say it collapsed, and it did, but pieces of it have stayed with us for the last 2,000 years. And part of what stays with us is this idea that when something is given as a gift, it comes from the hand of a higher status person to a lower status person. So we think of gifts hierarchically. And that action right there incurs this, a debt. it was amazing to me how many times when I talked to people and I said I was writing a book about gratitude, um, and please forgive me, especially the gentleman in the room, there was an actual gendered response to when I talked about writing a book called Grateful. And that is almost exclusively the women who were my friends, my clergy colleague friends, my academic friends, just girlfriends in general, would always say, "Oh wow, grateful, gratitude. That is a great subject. I really have found that to transform my life. It is so important, and it's really important for society." And then my male friends would say, "I'm not sure I like that topic." And I would say, "Why?" And they would say something to like this: "I just don't want to be in anyone's debt." And there is actually a gendered response to the idea and the ethics of gratitude. There was one study which compared attitudes of men and women worldwide around the practice of gratitude, and American men, are the least grateful people in the world. And I think it's related to this. I think it's related to the idea of this structure of gratitude creating debt. You being the client to someone else's privilege. And so you're obligated, you're indebted until you pay back. I am in your debt. You have incurred a debt of gratitude. And that, of course, becomes part of what happens in ancient Rome. That's part of what holds this system together. This horrible patronage system is the clients really are in debt until they can discharge the debt. And if they can't discharge the debt, and this is what happened in the Roman Empire, is that the clients got pushed down further into indebtedness and poverty and lower classes. And the further they got pushed down, the less possible it was for them to get back up. And so a debt of gratitude became an incredibly heavy burden to pay. And I think that we have this, the remnant of this is still in our culture. And this is another remnant of it that's still in our culture. Just to do this etymology stuff around the word, started leading me on all these amazing, wonderful bunny trails, is of course we get this directly from that system, quid pro quo. And this is the idea that not only a debt is incurred in a distant and oppressive social structure that you may or may not have ever chosen to be part of, but within that social structure, people began to figure out ways of surviving. And so they developed this strategy of quid pro quo. And that is the givers would figure out that they could give a gift in order to get somebody to behave in a way that they wanted to. And the receivers, if they chose to receive such a gift, could put themselves in debt to the right person. So you could find yourself a better patron, as it were. And perhaps even as we get people like Zacchaeus in the New Testament, work your way up just a little bit in that social structure so you could find benefit for your family or a sense of safety or just a little bit more bread on your table than you would otherwise have. And so quid pro quo is the idea that givers, with the intention of controlling the recipient, the benefactor, give a gift with that as its purpose. And the receiver, the benefactor, takes the gift knowing that it is going to employ some mechanism of reward on the other side. Now, that happened in ancient Rome across social classes. So a senator could give a quid pro quo to another senator, and that would be a way of accomplishing some political end. So it could take place that way. Or a quid pro quo could take place up and down in terms of a class structure. And that's actually one of the ways, of course, that Rome also held together, is the idea of selling off positions such as that of being a tax collector to people in oppressed communities. And so they dangled in front of oppressed people a higher status job and said, hey, if you bid on this, you can be a tax collector and you can not just be a fisherman or a slave down here, but you can move up in the social structure if you do these things. And so people like Zacchaeus got their pennies together and said, okay, I take the quid pro quo. And so they move up in the system. Now, that system of debt and indebtedness and quid pro quo is what is behind, of course, the social structure in the New Testament. And there were Romans who had something to say about this. This is one of them. Cicero had a lot to say about gratitude, as did Seneca, actually. And I saw this quote, first of all, on a poster, a little sort of one of those cheerful gratitude posters that you could buy online. Gratitude is not only the greatest of virtues, but the parent of all others. And I thought, isn't that nice? You know, wouldn't you like to have that poster hanging in your dorm with a sunset or something on it? Until, of course, you realize what Cicero is talking about. And Cicero is, of course, talking about that whole horrible structure of oppression. And what he is saying is that if gratitude was rightly understood within this system, if it was practiced virtually or virtuously, with the giver or the benefactor not seeking to control, but instead just giving gifts, and the receiver feeling the response of being given a gift freely returns gratitude, well, then Rome would be virtuous. And what Cicero is saying is that the whole idea of indebted obligation and quid pro quo, tit for tat, those two things had corrupted what should be a virtuous system. And that should be the thing that, this should be how Rome really lives, this idea of virtuous reciprocity that benefits everyone in the pyramid. And of course, praises Caesar. So Cicero saw the problems and he tried to correct them through an ethical practice of gratitude. But of course, what Cicero did not see is that it was about the structure itself. Cicero never thought that we had to take down the pyramid. He just thought you could fix gratitude in the midst of it. And of course, that's when you get to this guy. And Jesus wants to take down the pyramid. And this story here, this is, of course, the Zacchaeus story, for those of you who missed that Sunday school lesson. This is probably the third story I ever learned in Methodist Church when I was a little girl. And the first one was baby Jesus. The second one was dying Jesus. And the third one was Jesus calling Zacchaeus out of the tree. This story really only makes sense to grown-ups, at least, once we understand that Zacchaeus has climbed up the gratitude system. As a person who was an oppressed person, a Jew who was in the structure that oppressed him, he buys his way higher up in a quid pro quo arrangement with Rome to become a tax collector. He's really good at it, so he becomes a chief tax collector. And Zacchaeus is, by his very nature, a climber. And so we get this little story about how when Jesus comes to town, and one of the things Zacchaeus surely knows by this point is that Jesus has said a few things about Caesar and taxes and other stuff. And Zacchaeus is very worried that Jesus is coming to cut in on his action, that if, of course, Jesus stirs up some sort of rebellion or revolution, which is in the air, Jesus starts questioning this whole arrangement, that's going to put Zacchaeus out of a job. And so Zacchaeus, yeah, he's short, but he is also really smart. So he runs to the edge of town and he climbs a tree because he's got to be the first person to see what this guy is up to. Jesus comes into the town, sees Zacchaeus up there. Come down out of that tree, Zacchaeus. I love this. First thing Jesus does in this encounter, get out of the branches of the gratitude system. Get out of that structure. come down, stand here on this ground with me. And then, of course, he invites Zacchaeus. He invites himself to dinner at Zacchaeus' house. And so we have the table showing up again. And, that's just such a great image of Jesus, because if we didn't know it was political before, as soon as Jesus issues a dinner invitation, we know it's political. And I'm sure that some of you teach this in your classes, because dinner invitations were part of the currency of the gratia system. They were one of the things that higher status people could issue to lower status people or same status people in order to create quid pro quo or indebtedness arrangements. Dinner invitations strengthened the pyramid. They strengthened Caesar's hand. And so Jesus says, get out of the tree, no more quid pro quo. And instead, one of the things that Jesus begins to unpack in this confrontation with Zacchaeus is the idea of grace. As that grace is not just Caesar's gratia, but instead grace is the encounter with the divine, with a transformative, face-to-face, on the ground, being in relationship with one another around a table that is for free. I literally, while I was working on the book, I just popped this question into Google. What is the opposite of quid pro quo? And the answer comes up. Pro bono. For the good. Pro bono undoes quid pro quo. And that is the way that Christian theology talks about, that's the word we use, grace. Free. Lutherans, you got it right. Free gift, the most radical thing that is actually possible. Free gift, grace, undoes oppressive social structures. Free, pro bono. Jesus says stuff like this. When you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or rich neighbors, in case they may invite you in return. In other words, undo quid pro quo invitations. Then you would be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, and you will be blessed, because they cannot repay you. For you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. And so that's not like getting a quid pro quo from God, because what everybody knows who hears Jesus say this is that the resurrection of the righteous is a really long time from now. And so it's like kind of not getting repaid at all. Way, way off there, you're going to be blessed. Something good's going to happen to you. But here in this world, you do things, you give gifts without expectation of repayment. For the good, pro bono grace. This becomes the liberative moment where all debts are canceled, and where our Presbyterian friends got the translation right. Then pray then like this, and forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. While I was writing Grateful, I wound up preaching in a church in Canada, which was right near a university. And it just so happened that this little United Church of Canada got a good number of students to come over from the university on any given Sunday, some 15 or 20. And maybe they were assigned to show up when I was preaching, but by their religious studies prof. And so, but there was a good number of young adult students in the congregation, and it just so happened this was the text that I was preaching on out of the lectionary that day. So I was writing about gratitude. I was thinking about this social structure, and then this prayer comes up in the sermon cycle. And my background was church history. I was pretty good in seminary at exegesis, but it was not something I became an expert in by any stretch of the imagination. And so I went back and I started looking at this and started reading things, and I went, how did I ever miss this? That the Lord's Prayer is really about economics. And it's about the economics of the ancient Roman Empire. And it's about Jubilee reframed into a prayer from Jesus. and that it really is truly about this idea of debt and taking down systems and structures that hold people in oppression, releasing us from debts. This is the Christian vision of the Jubilee. So I got very excited about this, and I'm preaching, and I got to the middle of the sermon, and I had long left my text, and I just literally blurted out, Jesus envisions a debt-free world. And I look out, and there are 20 students sitting there with their mouths really hanging open. After the service, I was standing at the door, and many of the older congregants came by to shake my hand. And I noticed the students were in line, so I quickly got rid of the older congregants. They were very kind, but I wanted to hear what the students had to say. And so the students came up to me, and they said, "Did Jesus really teach that?" And I said, yes. I said, that's what the whole purpose of the New Testament is that Jesus is taking down the structures of indebtedness of the ancient Roman world and proposing an entirely different way to live. And one of the students looked at me and said, I never knew that. Because that's what we're dreaming of too. That's what our generation is dreaming of, a debt-free world. And I just said, well, I'm dreaming with you. And then one of them said, you mean to tell me Jesus is like Bernie Sanders? And I said, well, you know, they're both Jews. Gratitude is tied into this social structure. And the New Testament presents, of course, a geometry and equation of gratitude that is different than the gratitude equation that shows up in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. And the New Testament's gratitude equation is that the awareness of grace plus freedom from debt, liberation, is living in God's abundance. And that is the central vision from the very beginnings all the way through Jesus recasting and reframing that ancient message of Jubilee, of Sabbath, that was presented at the origins of Israel. Now, what's not in my slides, because I'm trying to figure out exactly how to present it without being overly political, but I think that might be impossible, is that this whole thing back here, hey, let's make Rome great again. Yeah, every single time there was a crisis in ancient Rome, the whole sort of political emphasis of the moment was, how do you make the system stronger? How do you build it more firmly? How do you create more power at the top? And this is pretty much not only the history of Rome, but it becomes the history of Western culture. Trump talks about gratitude all the time. When I was writing this book, I went back and I reread every single speech he gave on the campaign trail. I watched videos of different events, and it was remarkable how much he talked about gratitude. What he would always do is he would thank the people who were his supporters, the people who were loyal to him, and he would insult and call people ingrates who did not go along with his reciprocal plan. Indeed, things like this would constantly happen, is that he would say, oh, look, there's the media out there. I'm so good for them. Their ratings are up because of me, but they never say thank you. And so he was the benefactor, giving a gift of ratings to the clients, the media. And the media were so poorly formed that they could not even turn around and say thank you. It wasn't just the media, but when, for example, Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico, he was coming out and saying all the time, oh, the government is doing the best ever, you know, we're got the best response ever going for the hurricane. And the mayor of San Juan, Puerto Rico, she came on to Twitter and fought back. And she said, no, it's been very slow. The people are dying. We need more help. You know, you're not telling the truth. This is really a terrible situation down here. And the president came back and said, you're an ingrate. He called the mayor of San Juan an ingrate on Twitter. Other ingrates on the list, the media, the mayor of San Juan, the UCLA basketball players who were almost arrested and thrown in jail by the Chinese government because somebody had done something. What was it? I can't remember what the crime was. Shoplifting in China. And so they were going to be thrown in jail. Donald Trump got on, said, well, I stopped the Chinese from doing this and they're free. And not one of them has said thank you. There was a really interesting exchange where it was before the face-to-face between Trump and Hillary Clinton, but it's really important for understanding what happened in the head-to-head election in the fall. This happened in the spring during a Republican debate. And one of the people, one of the pundits, asked Trump about something he said about Hillary Clinton, and Trump had borrowed the line that Bernie Sanders had used, which is an interesting thing, that Clinton could not be a free agent because she had taken a $500,000 speaking fee from Goldman Sachs. And then there was also a whole bunch of stuff that was associated with that was sort of being put into the media about the Clinton Family Foundation and who gave money to the Clinton Family Foundation. Now, so the pundit asked Trump about this, and Trump said, well, you know, she's always going to owe them. So the idea in Trump's head was, this idea, of course, is that if someone gives you a gift, you're their client. And that clients can never be free from reciprocal obligation. There's no idea in the current president's mind that a gift could be free. A gift is always about a quid pro quo, or a gift is always about a payoff. And so what happened is that he depicted the person who was going to be his eventual opponent as a client to another patron. And that was actually followed up on by the person, I don't remember who was the moderator of that particular debate, but the moderator followed up and said, well, how do you know that she is going to be at the behest of Goldman Sachs? And he said, well, I know because I gave the Clinton Foundation a gift. And then the moderator kind of looked puzzled, and he said, and so when I told her she had to be at my wedding, she had to come. And so the construct in his mind is that his opponent was a beneficiary who would never be free from obligation or debt, which is interesting in some ways too, because it winds up being a gendered analysis on top of a gratitude analysis. And so that it was as if a woman who received a gift could never be a free agent. She's always going to be a client. And he set himself up as the pure benefactor. He talked about self-funding his entire campaign because he would never then owe anyone any favors. This is why the Russia thing makes him crazy. Because if Russia is true, it means he actually was a recipient and not a pure benefactor. And in his worldview, he has to be the pure benefactor who is giving out gifts Two, and this is the best part of the whole campaign, the right beneficiaries. Because what he was saying was, not only will I be the pure benefactor, but the whole problem with America has become that the wrong people are benefiting from America's largesse. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to be this pure benefactor who clears out the rubble of the wrong benefactors and make sure that only the wrong beneficiaries, and make sure that only the right beneficiaries get what they're entitled to. Both. White or right. The only right ones are white ones. And so those right beneficiaries will then be able to say thank you. And I'm sure some of you live in markets where the commercial came out at Christmas time. I live in Northern Virginia. We see nothing conservative ever in my media market. Everybody, when they run for office, they're out progressiving everybody else. And so a few of you, the exception is all you people from like the Pacific Northwest. But the rest of you might actually see some of these conservative commercials. I happen to be, I think I was in Kansas right before Christmas doing something, and on the television there was this commercial where literally it was put out by Trump 2020 campaign, and it was, "Thank you, President Trump. Thank you for these great new tax cuts. Thank you for this. Thank you for that." It was one person after another saying thank you to the president. And then the last one was a young teenage girl saying, "And thank you, President Trump, that we can say Merry Christmas again." That was put out by the GOP. It was a commercial about a circle of this kind of gratitude. This is the invisible argument that we were having all during the 2016 campaign that we were paying no attention to. And what happened was Trump had a very strong, very provocative, and very well organized narrative around gratitude, around benefactors, benefits, and beneficiaries. And that structure of gratitude is something that is so deeply ingrained in so many of us that when we heard it, we responded to it. And of course, the problem is there was no counter narrative. I think in some ways, Hillary Clinton's campaign with their slogan, "Stronger Together," was trying to probably depict something like this. But you can't put it on a hat. And it's counterintuitive. Unless you are morally or spiritually formed in the ethics of a table, you can't get your imagination there from political slogans. And that's one of the things that we have to work on, my friends. If we want to talk about what good religious studies and ethics and teaching New Testament and all these things, religion and culture can be towards these larger political and social questions, teaching alternate systems of ethics, like this idea of the table, that is not just part of Christianity, but it's part of Judaism, it's part of Islam, it's part of Sikhism, it's part of Buddhism. It comes out in different ways in all these different world traditions. And everybody cares about issues of abundance, gifts, benefits, beneficiaries, gratitude. Everybody cares about these issues. But we aren't doing it clearly enough for it to make a social difference. And so we get stuck instead of in liberation with crying students in a line in a church in Canada, simply dreaming of a debt-free world and unable to make that politically operative, trying everything they can do to make that work. A big part of the problem, of course, is that Christianity went back on its own story so quickly and created, this is something, you know, I've learned from people in this room and people whose spirit are just in this room, is that we quickly created not a table fellowship, not a table Jesus, but we created an imperial Jesus. And so we moved from, we created this as the idea of light instead of this being the idea of light. And it also means our teaching of ethics in a Christian vein has had a geometry. And that's the way I grew up with that geometry. I'm still having arguments every day with people about this geometry. Anytime you say you have a debt of gratitude, you're living in this geometry. Or can we move towards this as an alternate geometry? I was with some Methodists in Arizona a few weeks ago. Any of you who are not Methodists, I urge you, be really nice to your Methodist friends. They're having a big denominational argument right now, and it's very unpleasant. But I showed these two pictures, and the room almost got destroyed because there were clearly people in the room who this was the geometry of their idea of what Methodism should be. And there were other people in the room who had this as the geometry of what their life should be. And after having a big fight in front of me and me having a hard time getting control of the room again, one person came up to me afterwards and said, you know, when you shifted from this to this, I could breathe again. That's what my vocation has become, is giving people who care about these issues room to breathe again. So if we can't breathe, if we can't be grateful, immediately we move from the fear of the reptilian brain forward, and we start fighting one another, and we start running away, cowering in fear. Gratitude, geometrically appropriate gratitude, gives us room to breathe. It creates a different option for the way in which faith, religion, spirit, sacredness can be operative in our political and social life. In this room, for those of you who have helped me see that more clearly about the call that the Spirit has on my own life, I thank you very much. I started in the academy teaching for 14 years and then wound up outside of the walls of academia, writing books and newspaper columns and all that sort of stuff. And it's been an amazing place to be. One of the things I know is that within the walls of the academy, there are many, 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 many of you that are trying to do this. And I commend you, and I encourage you, and I say thank you. If you're trying to create space for your students to breathe, the undergraduate students who need to be able to breathe, to be able to tackle the world's problems, like these amazing students who are heading to DC this weekend, they need to breathe, not just functioning out of fear, but letting that fear migrate to a neocortex that is smart and wise and can process that fear in ways that are provocative and change-oriented. Those of you who work in seminary settings with clergy, oh my gosh, if you can help them see the possibilities of breathable space, of a table of gratitude. They can change their congregations, their denominations, and hopefully those moves will make a difference in the world. And so this was my next chapter, writing about gratitude. I did not know when I started the book. I thought I was writing a book about saying thank you, and I wind up writing political theology. As we leave for lunch, I leave you with Lin-Manuel Miranda's benediction. Good night, even though it's midday, so we'll say good afternoon. Curl up with gratitude for the ground beneath you, your beating heart. Let's proceed from there. Thank you.